Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is officially the afternoon, ready or not, right? The weather might be changing and causing us to slow down, but we are still here. We're putting on great programs. We're excited to invite incredible historians like what we have this morning. I would ask everybody, if you haven't already, please silence your phones. We are live streaming today. It will be online, so if your phone goes off, you will be remembered in perpetuity as the one who caused everybody to look around weirdly on the recording. So take care of that now. I would also remind you, it may seem like it's a long time away, but it is really not. If you have young ones in your life, go ahead and mark December 13th. Holiday Play-a-Palooza. Free family activities. We have Santa Claus, we have face painting, we have really, really fun games, refreshments, prizes for free for our community. So go ahead and mark it, December 13th. It's a Saturday. Grab the grandkids or the neighbors or the weird kids at the bus stop so that you can get in. It doesn't matter to us. You might want to check with their parents. And then the last day that the Western Heritage Center will be open for the season will be December 20th. So just kind of getting those on your radar now. Like I said, it's really not that far away. So hopefully everybody started their Christmas shopping. Today, I'm very excited. Joe reached out to me, oh my gosh, close to a year ago now, right?
Yeah.
He was like, hey, I'm doing this research and I think it's cool. And he told me a little bit about it, and I went, that's really cool. Let's get you in. And so today we are joined by Joe Lanning. Joe is a part of the Billings Public Library's team of reference librarians with the additional privilege of overseeing the library's Montana Room, which is an incredible collection of rare bibliographic materials related to Montana history. I use the Montana Room all the time. And its archival manuscript and photographic collection. He received his bachelor's in history from California State University, Fullerton, and his master's in history from Utah State University. As it may become apparent in the next couple of minutes, Joe has a special interest in the history of the American university system, particularly how the American historical profession developed throughout the 20th century. Joe lives here in Billings. He's a wonderful member of our community with his amazing wife, his perfect daughter, and their furry son, Thomas. So join me in welcoming Joe Lanning. Thank you.
Is this loud enough if I hold it around a little bit closer? All right, I'll do it. I want to say that this is an absolute privilege to be able to speak here today at the Western Heritage Center for their High Noon Lecture Series. Right before my family moved to Billings, I called the Western Heritage Center to try and learn a little bit about the city and maybe make a connection that could lead to potential employment. And I spent about an hour speaking with Kevin about Billings and its history, its politics, where a guy with 2 degrees in history might be able to find work. I'm very lucky to have landed my job at the Billings Public Library, which has allowed me to work with Kevin, with Laura, Cecilia multiple times on various projects. And look at this, now I'm here today in the old Parmley Billings Library, right? Where Joseph Sharp did art workshops for the community and where Ann Whitmack and Myrtle Jones actually worked during this period I'm going to talk with you today about. And now I'm here presenting, and I mean to say it, it's a real honor to be here. So yeah, I'm Joe Lanning. I'm the Montana Room Librarian with the Billings Public Library. And I'm here today to share with you the story of Myron Tripp and Rocky Mountain College. It's a pretty unique story, I think, not only because it's one out of really only a handful of known occurrences of violations of academic freedom that happened here in Montana, but also because there are some elements and details to this story that I think we just don't see very often, even when examining cases nationwide. And I want to say right off the bat, I added this last night because I was reading through it again. I thought, I'm just going to say this. This is not intended to be an indictment against Rocky Mountain College in any way. I'm here today simply to share some Cold War history that happened here in Billings in 1949, and it just so happens that it happened at Rocky. I wrote my thesis on a very similar case that happened at the University of Utah, also in 1949. And as you'll see later in the presentation, there's no shortage of institutions of higher learning that this sort of thing happened at during this era. Here in Billings, we actually had one. I think that's the fascinating story. It was Rocky Mountain College, but it could have been anywhere. I'm going to start by introducing you to the story the same way that I was introduced to it, and just start off by reading the letter that Myron sent to Ann Whitmack. Somewhere in this place was her office, the director of the Parmley Billings Library, in October of 1956. I found this letter while weeding our vertical files one day, and I couldn't believe what I had found, again, because of the connection to my thesis. But let's go ahead and read it together and find out what was on Myron's mind when he sent this letter. So this is the only time, I promise you, this is the only time I'm going to read to you what's on the screen. I won't make that a habit. Let's read it together. Enclosed is the AAUP report on my dismissal. This is the actual AAUP report that Myron sent to Ann Whitmack. Oddly enough, I erroneously imagined in 1949 that I was voting on the liquor and gambling and other social issues in a manner acceptable to the Methodist and Congregationalist leaders. But E.E. Collins, John Keefe, and Reverend Mr. Beale and others voted to deprive me of my presumably permanent profession. Before I became a candidate, President Copeland and various trustees assured me my candidacy and political activities would not affect my professional tenure. After the 1949 sessions, Keefe told me prohibitionist and welfare states could not be tolerated. Much later, Reverend Caton told me fundamentalists and neo-Orthodox people were not wanted on the faculty of Rocky Mountain. It is true that if I could live my life over again, I would not openly advocate legal equality for Negroes, labor safety bills, civil rights for Hutterites and other minorities, outlawry of gambling, and other ideas objectionable to Methodist and Congregationalist business leaders as long as my parents were alive. Since Billings church leaders have been communicating with the FBI and with schools where I have taught in order to disseminate false charges of communism against me, I decided to move to Canada and become a British subject in order to escape further persecution from Methodist and Congregationalist quote-unquote patriots. This fall, I wish I could be back in Billings to work for Olson for governor and for Charles Banderoff for state representative and against E.E. Collins, candidate for district judge. Every time I give my tithes and offering to the Orthodox Friends, it is with a prayer and hope that I can thereby do something to counteract the religious influence of A.G. Peterson, Reverend Akins, Reverend Beale, once again, E.E. Collins, and the Honorary George Pierce. Yours truly, Myron Tripp. That was something, wasn't it? Imagine me reading that in the library going, what am I looking at right now, right? Now, there are definitely some takeaways from Myron's letter. If we were leading like a book discussion here, I'd think we'd have plenty of points that we could talk about. But I also think that there's one statement in particular that we might talk about more than other. And I think it's that one that says, it is true that if I could do it all over again, I would not openly advocate for. That's the one to me that stands out among the rest. Notably, reason, I guess, that I would say that is, there are plenty of examples of left-leaning figures during this era who shifted to the right? There's Whittaker Chambers, there's Sidney Hook, there's Ronald Reagan. What I don't know of, though, is another example where a victim of McCarthyism openly regretted the ideologies that got them in trouble. That I don't know about. People lost their careers, professional scholars never taught again, people were blacklisted, some went to jail. They were forced to defend their political ideologies before ad hoc investigatory committees, before HUAC. But even with all that, wishing they had never advocated for the beliefs is not part of the common historical narrative. The typical reaction was instead to defend the beliefs while denying the connection to communism, or defend the beliefs, in like Myron's case, defend the beliefs and deny that that makes you un-American or unfit to teach, something like that, right? But not reject the beliefs, and not 7 years after the fact. That's another interesting element that I think is kind of unique to this letter. Anyways, that's the letter that Myron sent to our director in 1956, along with the actual AEUP report, which I brought here today again, that had just been published, by the way, in 1956. And I'm going to talk a little bit more on that later. And as you can see now why I had to find out what happened to him, try to make sense of his claims, and also I wanted to figure out Rocky's side of the story and see what the official minutes could tell us or the presidential papers, and try and determine as well how this case fits into the larger national story of post-World War II political repression, which is that political and social phenomenon that we commonly refer to as McCarthyism. So I'm going to go ahead and get cracking now and formally begin. And I'm going to do so by starting with a little bit of background on Rocky Mountain College, a small Christian college located right here in Billings, Montana. In 1947, which was just 2 years before all this happened with Myron, Rocky was incorporated by way of merger between the Intermountain Union College and Billings Polytechnic Institute. Right? And the purpose of this unification was to take these two smaller colleges and merge them into a singular Christian university, one that could provide a baccalaureate education, but with Christian values baked into the curriculum and the students' overall college experience. So at Rocky, dress codes and curfews were enforced. And at Rocky, the legal doctrine, known as in loco parentis, which is essentially when, in the absence of a parent, the university kind of acts as that authority figure, that was put to use at Rocky as well. And the college, at this time of its infancy, had 3 Christian denominations attached to it: Methodist, Presbyterian, and Congregationalism, right? It was a member of the Congregational Christian College Council. It was on the board of Christian education of the Presbyterian Church, and it was endorsed by the Baptist Convention of Montana. These affiliations were willingly inherited from Intermountain and Billings Polytechnic, and they came right along to Rocky when they did the merger, because they fit right into the design of Rocky Mountain College as a Christian alternative to its more secular counterparts. The board of trustees at this time was made up of these individuals and some others, but 5 clergymen, 5 businessmen, and 3 professional men, right? And at this early stage of the college's existence, these men were facing some pretty serious financial challenges. I mean, there's a lot we could talk about, with the early stages of Rocky in this period, but the financial challenges, I think, had a direct impact with Myron's story. Enrollment, it turns out, is a pretty significant source of revenue for colleges and universities. And enrollment at this time, again, early in its formative years, had been much lower than anticipated, sometimes reaching only half of what the board had hoped for and needed. To kind of put that in perspective, if you're hoping for 500 students to enroll, right, for your coming semester, and they're going to enroll at $150 a pop, right, that's $75,000. But when only 220 enroll, that's $33,000. And that's a pretty significant hit to a college with an annual operating budget of $200,000, right? They're really looking to increase that enrollment. Now, gleaning what I could from the board minutes and from Lawrence Small's 2 fantastic books on the history of Rocky, by the way, the reason enrollment was so much lower than what the board needed was that at this time, Rocky was only recognized as a junior college, right? That's what its accreditation allowed for. And this academic limitation was making it difficult to attract the students it wanted to. Without a doubt, parents wanted their kids to go to a Christian college, and students wanted to go to a Christian college as well. That's the purpose of Rocky. They recognized that the community was going to be welcoming of this. And you could do that at Rocky. But the only first 2 years of a bachelor's is what you were going to get, right? And then you'd have to transfer to a 4-year university. So I'm thinking that the consideration might have just been, why not just go to the 4-year university? There's plenty of other alternatives. I don't have to go that far from home. There's University of Montana. There's MSU Bozeman. I think they have a college in Wyoming, maybe. That's my buddy Taylor. He's from Wyoming. So Rocky really needed that accreditation, right, as a baccalaureate institution to increase its enrollment and establish the college as a legitimate choice for a 4-year education in the community. That was the college's main goal at the time. And you see that all throughout the board minutes. It was also the cause, this is another presentation, another investigation I really want to do. I'm not going to do it, but somebody should. But it's a cause for some pretty contentious relationships between the board members at this time. It was a bit of a stressful time for the board, especially for President Copeland. But anyways, okay, so we know that Rocky needs accreditation, right? That's my story here. A big step in a college obtaining and maintaining accreditation as a four-year college is the presence of professional scholars on your faculty. Because regional accrediting bodies want to know that you have professionals teaching your courses and leading your departments, right? Not amateurs. So enter Myron Tripp. At the time of his appointment, Tripp held 3 advanced degrees from extremely prestigious universities, and he was a bona fide published academic with 7 years teaching experience in higher education. He was a minister with the Orthodox Friends Church, so I believe that means he was a Quaker, and he was also a guest pastor from time to time at Methodist and Presbyterian churches across eastern Montana. He was a perfect fit for Rocky. He checked every single box. And I think President Copeland was extremely happy to bring him on because he, again, Copeland, was without a doubt starting to feel significant pressure from his colleagues on the board to do his part in Rocky obtaining that accreditation. So in June of 1948, Tripp accepts a 1-year appointment to teach social studies and history at Rocky, after which his contract would have to be renewed. That was the standard for all teachers at Rocky because there was no tenure system at Rocky at this time. A reality that kind of contradicts what Tripp says in his letter, right? That President Copeland assured him a permanent spot on Rocky's faculty, albeit in what was most likely a handshake sort of deal. Which, when I think about it, probably absolutely happened because, again, President Copeland was more than likely very happy to have a very bona fide academic on his staff leading his history department, and it did nothing but good things for the accreditation. And I'm sure President Copeland probably did say, I think you'll be here forever. It just sounds like Tripp took that very seriously and did not get it in writing in any way. So Tripp gets the job at Rocky. And then, sometime during his first semester, this is the fall of 1948, by the way, right? So June of 1948, he gets a job. He starts his first semester in the fall semester of 1948. Sometime during that first semester, he decides to run for the Montana House of Representatives as a Democrat representing Yellowstone County. And in November of 48, the election, he wins. The problem, it's not really a problem, I guess, because they worked it out, but the wrinkle is that he still has 3 more semesters to go in his contract. So he and the board arranged for a substitute to be hired in his place. They won Fanny Gitlin from Chicago. And she would come and fill in for him for the remainder of the contract, so for the coming winter, spring, and summer semesters. Technically, they only needed the sub to teach the winter semester, and then after the legislative session, which ended in March of 49, Tripp could come back, right, and just pick up during probably the early spring semester. But to make the position more attractive and to actually, offer somebody more than just 1 semester of pay, they agreed to offer the substitute the remainder of the contract. So you'll be teaching for 3 semesters. And Tripp was completely fine with this. I think it made total sense, no problems. So Tripp gets elected in November. In December of 1948, Tripp finishes the fall 48 semester, semester's over, and in January of 1949, he heads out to Helena to legislate as the lone Democrat out of 5 total representatives for Yellowstone County. He's the one Democrat. But we'll remember from history, 1949 is kind of an up year for Democrats, right? Truman had just retained the presidency over Dewey in that major upset where he's holding up the paper and stuff. Democrats had won the House nationally, and they'd also won the House in Montana. So maybe Tripp was hopeful that he was part of like this national progressive-minded movement, and he was going to be able to go off to Helena and really advocate for what he believed in. And get some progressive legislation pushed through the House. That is definitely not what happened in that legislative session. Here's a handful of bills that Tripp supported in that 48-49 legislative session, and here's how they fared. I want to go into them one by one, but I won't go into them one by one. I think you get a sense of their overall nature just kind of gleaming over them, right? They're very pro-worker. They're very pro-regulation. He wants more money for retirees. He's anti-capital punishment. That got a lot of press. That you can search the Billings Gazette's microfilm. We can do it for you at the library with newspapers.com. Oh, he took a lot of heat for being anti-capital punishment. I didn't put it on here, but I should have. He also supports a bill to exempt Hutterites from the selective service. He alludes to that in his letter. Remember, that's one of the points he makes. He wants them, and he supports them being exempt from the selective service. Another one that he got kind of hammered for. But anyways, you get the idea. This is what he stands for. This one check mark, by the way, he did help secure $20,000 to go to the state's district attorney's office to investigate and help enforce gambling laws and the liquor monopoly. That only made things worse. I'm not going to really get into it later, but you see what kind of, we all know where this is going anyways. He didn't keep his job, right? That didn't help it. The one thing he did win just made things worse for him, to be honest. Nevertheless, you get the idea. Tripp was a progressive, no doubt about it. We know from his letter to Ann Whitmack, though, despite, kind of like laying his claim to these stakes right here, right? We know from his letter to Ann that he thought he was legislating in ways that were not just in line with his Christian values, but also with what he thought to be in a manner acceptable to the Methodist and Congregationalist leaders of Billings. And that, another quote, his political activities would not affect his professional tenure. I'm digressing a little bit here. I read what I wrote time and time again. I've read through this so many times. I reread his letter. I reread the AEP report. I really start to wonder how much he thought he was safe. It was 1949, and he knew there's a lot of stuff going on in the country, not just in 1949. There was things since the early 1940s and before then. Did he really think he was completely safe? I guess I wonder. I'm not calling it a legitimacy his letter, but just how safe he thought he was, boy, do I wonder. Nevertheless, after a couple of months of voting entirely opposite to how the other representatives from Yellowstone County were voting, one of them, and it's probably Melvin Hoynes, and I can't be sure, but it just says Representative M long dash. There's only one representative with an M in their name at this time from Yellowstone, and it's Melvin Hoynes, and I'm pretty sure he was close with Collins and Keefe, but that's hearsay. I can't say it's Hoynes, but it is. One of them reached out to two of Rocky's board members, Elmer Collins and John Keefe, letting them know that Tripp was voting in ways, quote, unfriendly to business interests, which was not great, because the board of that small Christian college, right, that's in a financially precarious situation, and the board of the college that Myron is hoping to return to and teach again at, that board was very much actively seeking donations from local business leaders at the times to help with that funding shortfall. Now I'm gonna have to start timelining things a lot with this information coming up, so kind of get ready for that, but it's just where this has to go. So we're gonna say, I'm gonna catch you back up. December 48, he goes, semester ends. January 49, he goes off to Helena. He's legislating, he's doing all this stuff. Sometime in early March, Tripp gets word from a friendly board member at Rocky that his reappointment at the college might not be as set in stone as he thinks it is, despite, once again, his belief that he was a permanent fixture on the faculty. Okay. So, Tripp's a little worried about his job. On March 10th, 1949, Tripp reaches out to President Copeland to make sure that his job is safe, one, and to make it clear that he plans to return for that fall of 49 semester. When Fanny Gitlin's done teaching the rest of my courses, I'm coming back in the fall of 49. And President Copeland assures him that his job is safe. Despite this rather cryptic note that President Copeland wrote in his journal on this day, talk to Tripp, we'll let him know later. We'll let him know what later? That's a big, just leaving it out there. We'll let him know you got him on the phone right now. Maybe you tell him now. It seems like it's kind of important. But Copeland doesn't do that. Whatever it is, he doesn't, I don't think, he tells Tripp what is going on. Then, a couple weeks after that, March 28th, the board's faculty committee met to discuss the faculty for the coming year. And we see in this note, which I'm going to decipher for you in a second, we see in this note from Copeland's journal that they agreed to, okay, so we're looking at the one here that says 2 p.m. is what I assume that is. Faculty committee, board agreed to keep all but Gitlin, perhaps Tripp. That's how I read that. That's how I'm not very good, but I think that's what that says. I've gone over 1,000 times and I can't see anything else. Everything underneath that does not have to do with Tripp, which I thought it might, but it doesn't. It's about faculty unity among the faculty, which Copeland was struggling with very much at this time, to get the faculty united. So the bottom one doesn't have to do with Tripp, but that 2 o'clock one does. Keep all but Gitlin, perhaps Tripp. Okay, so we know then, at this point, there's no doubt, Copeland knows now, at the very least, that maybe there are some other board members that are having doubts about rehiring Tripp. I think that's how we can put this together, at least. That's my argument. Here, I thought you might like to see, here are the actual minutes of that faculty committee meeting, right? And as you can see, not only is Tripp not listed, you can take my word for it, by the way, I've been over 1,000 times again, but he's not on that list. Not only is he not on the list, there's no history or social studies teacher whatsoever on this list. Not even George Rogers, who I think is the eventual replacement. There's no anybody on that list for the coming 49 year for history and social studies. Copeland knew, though, that this list was going to be the proposed list at the coming big board meeting, right? Where the board gets together and officially votes on the coming faculty for the 1949 school year. So Copeland knows this is the list that's going to make it into the hands of the board later on in April. So that's March 28th, right? When they have this faculty meeting. Time's moving along here. In early April, and I think we can put together why pretty quickly, early April, Tripp once again receives word that his job at the college, and now is in complete jeopardy. Clearly, it seems to me that this board member got word of the name that wasn't on this list and reached out to Tripp to let them know it doesn't look very good for you because you're not on this list. So Tripp asked some of his friends and some of his colleagues, who were all very fond of him, by the way. He had great support from his colleagues at Rocky. He asked some friends and colleagues to write the board on his behalf. And he once again reaches out to Copeland, who I think he felt like he had a pretty good relationship with, to see if he can appear before the board to speak for himself. But Copeland once again assures him that he has nothing to worry about, despite, one, Copeland knowing the results of the faculty committee meeting, and two, you just kind of, at least I have to imagine Tripp at this moment, probably getting pretty frustrated, probably a little maddening, right? Hearing what he was hearing from a board member, but also hearing from Copeland that everything was fine. What are you talking about? This is all in your head, right? Well, again, that was sometime early April that he reached out to Copeland to ask about this. April 27th eventually did happen. The board meets and officially votes on the faculty for the coming year, and lo and behold, Tripp's not on the list. And just like that, Tripp is gone, and I mean gone. His employment and presence in Rocky ends as abruptly as that. He's never mentioned once again in the board minutes. He's never mentioned in the faculty committee minutes. He's not in President Hines' paper, who is right after President Copeland. He applied for the college 2 more times in 50 and 51. They never mentioned the fact that Tripp's even applying for the college again. And he's never once again mentioned in Copeland's diary either. Just like that, poof, no more Tripp. During its investigation in the case, the American Association of University Professors talked with several board members to try and figure out if Tripp's academic freedoms had been violated, right, during his dismissal. Both Collins and Keefe told that body that the board had the right to dismiss Tripp because his one-year contract had been fulfilled, right? It was a basic employer-employee situation in which a contract had been signed, it had been performed by both parties, and it just simply wasn't renewed. It's pretty straightforward. It's kind of hard to argue with that. The problem is that the principles of academic freedom prevent the termination of a professional scholar on such simple grounds, right? And President Copeland, being from academia, likely knew this because when the body reached out to him, he denied that. He came up with a different story. That's not why we let him go. Copeland told the body that Tripp had actually resigned from his position. He handed in his keys all the way back in December of '48 before going off to Helena to legislate. He said Tripp handed in his keys, he was done, he quit his position. This is where the indictment of Rocky thing really kind of started tripping in my mind. I'm just laying out the facts. We know that's not the case. For one thing, this is kind of like a small thing, but I thought it was kind of funny. This is from our yearbook, that picture. We have the Rocky's yearbook from 1949 in it, in the library. So I went and scanned it and put it on there, because this is the way Tripp shows up in the yearbook, right? For the coming year. He's on leave, right? Now on leave. And so the body said, well, who is responsible for this? And Copeland said, well, Dean Augers was. Dean Augers is the one that fulfilled that, yearbook, whatever. So they called Dean Augers, and he goes, me, Copeland's the one. Copeland had to actually approve every single page of that yearbook before it got published. And when did he approve this? December of 1948, when Tripp supposedly resigned his position. He didn't resign his position. We know that he marked him as leave because he was expecting him to not go off to Helena and legislate the way that he did. Nevertheless, that's the way this looks. That's one little thing. More damningly, though, than this, Tripp showed the AAUP when they reached out to him. Tripp showed the AAUP a letter that President Copeland wrote him in May of 1949. Remember, he got fired April 27th, right? May of 1949, Copeland sent Tripp a letter apologizing for not being able to convince the board to keep him on the faculty. What more do you really need to say than that? I really do feel that Copeland felt tremendously bad, and given the kind of dicey relationship that Copeland was experiencing on that board, I just don't think he had the power to convince them otherwise that they should stay. Okay, we also know that, okay, so why did Tripp go? I'm going to start getting it out a little bit. We know from the AAUP report that a potential donor told members of the board that a donation would not be given to the college if Tripp was kept on the faculty. That's pretty hard. That's pretty hard evidence right there. One board member was also quoted by another as saying that Tripp was let go, quote, in order that donations would come in and peace be restored. Peace be restored. Incidentally, that donation that I was talking about that was contingent on Tripp's dismissal, that never came in, despite the fact that Tripp was removed from the faculty. It seems likely, given the evidence collected by the AAUP, and I think finally contextualized by what we find in Rocky's archives, that the board didn't rehire Tripp because it considered his presence on the staff to be politically and financially radioactive. That's my contention. I have to make a quick digression and talk to you a little bit about this. Talk to you a little bit about the AAUP, because I know that not everybody's aware of what this organization does, what it stands for, why it even exists. So the AAUP, American Association of University Professors, was started in 1915 by Arthur Lovejoy and John Dewey for a couple of reasons. One, they wanted to create an organization that would speak for professors as a whole at a time when they felt that their professional voices were being marginalized by college presidents, trustees, and wealthy donors. In response to a string of firings and dismissals as well, this is number two, in response to a string of firings and dismissals that had been occurring since the late 1800s, but it really ramped up since 1900, perhaps most notably at the University of Chicago and Stanford University. So they create this organization and establish the principles of academic freedom, right, which basically provides scholars with the assurance that they'll be allowed to research, publish, and teach how they best see fit, because they are the professional. And that they'll be allowed to speak publicly without fear of retribution. It was in the university's best interest to respect these freedoms because, yes, they need scholars for that accreditation and to attract students. We went through that a little bit. But much more importantly, Every institution of higher learning has an academic mission of developing and disseminating knowledge for the common good. We hear that a lot about the common good that the university and the college provides the community. That's every single institution's mission, but that cannot be accomplished without scholars. So when a professor must constantly worry about whether they will be censored or sanctioned for exploring controversial or unpopular ideas, they're not going to seek the truth from wherever it might come, and in their professional judgment, where they might find it. And universities, for the most part, they don't want that. So that's just the idea behind academic freedom as established by the AAUP. That's a controversial, description I just gave, okay? You can decide whether you want to go that way or believe in the AAUP's mission or not. I'm just letting you know from the AAUP's standpoint, that's why they exist. And that's why they do investigations on professors who were let go for violations of academic freedom. This is nothing new, by the way. The concepts of intellectual freedom really date back to Socrates and probably even before that. In fact, there's a really great detailed book by two historians on the history of academic freedom that really show you it's nothing new. It's all throughout the Middle Ages and not a new concept. But anyways, I'm going to get back to Myron's case for you. There are two principles that the AAUP recognized, that the organization recognized that Rocky violated in their case with Tripp. This is the big one. I'm not going to read it. It basically says that a teacher is a citizen, and when they write or speak as citizens, they should be free from censorship or discipline. That's what Tripp did in Allen. That's what he was essentially let go for. The other one is kind of like a protective, right? The other one says that academic freedoms are provided to all faculty members, regardless of whether they have tenure or not. So it doesn't matter that Tripp didn't have tenure. And that includes actually, by the way, graduate students and students who do research at universities, right? That includes them. And it includes teachers with no tenure system in place, so they kind of thought of that as well. So despite what Collins and Keefe thought made perfect business sense, if they cared about respecting the principles of academic freedom, Rocky was not allowed to just cut Tripp loose, surely not because of his political leanings and activities, and doubly surely not because a donor or a potential or otherwise trustee donor, wealthy benefactor, demanded it. Tripp is just one out of well over 100 academics who, just between 1949 and 1955, were fired or denied tenure, they were not reappointed, or they were in some other way disciplined because of their political beliefs, their affiliations. Some refused to testify before HUAC, some pled the Fifth, some refused to sign a loyalty oath. We know that there were even more violations than this because not every violation came to light. Not everybody filed a report with the AAUP. Some were just fired, they quietly left, and tucked their tails and just tried to find a job at another institution somewhere and keep it on the down low that that had just happened. In case you're wondering as well, a point that I found to be really fascinating, if you're curious why the AAUP released its report 7 years after the fact, by the way, this is 1956 when this happened in 1949. They released the report 7 years later. It wasn't until 1955 when under a new president at the AAUP who was a little bit more capable of understanding the legal complexities and putting a team on the task that it required to do these investigations. It wasn't until then that these investigations were carried out. So every single one of these between 1949 and 1955, not one single one of them were investigated until 1955, when the AAUP under this new president decided to go and investigate every single past claim that had been made. That's why we have academic freedom and tenure, Rocky Mountain College, 1956. And by the way, of course, you probably put this together. These are not individuals, these are institutions that this happened at. So some of them, like Berkeley, Washington, definitely over the East Coast, there's multiple people. That's how we get more than 100 on this map here. But multiple people at universities were often victimized. Now, most of the victims at these institutions, they had to defend themselves against accusations of disloyalty. I think I went into that a little bit in the past. In this era, that usually meant being labeled a communist, which was argued to have this amazing power to make a professor incapable of impartiality and objectivity. because they were basically slaves to party line dogma. And Tripp was accused a number of times of being a communist. Once by a fellow Yellowstone County representative, and then also by a board member. And that statement, in fact, that I told you about earlier, that Tripp must go in order that donations would come in and peace be restored, that was made by a board member who accused Tripp of being a communist and was immediately challenged by another board member, a colleague on the board, who said that Tripp can't be a communist because he's a good Christian. And the response was, well, whatever, he's got to go, quote, in order that donations could come in again and peace be restored. For what it's worth, which is literally nothing, but for what it's worth, Tripp vociferously denied any attachment to communism and argued that he had denounced communism in speeches to labor groups as early as 1934, and that his writings while at Ohio State were denounced by the Communist Club. But in the end, what did it matter, right? Not much. He was arguing all this during the AUP's investigation, years after the damage had been done, and he had already left Billings anyways, so there wasn't too much point to it, but he did deny the association, for what it's worth. The accusations of an allegiance to communism is the one way that Tripp's case resembles so many others on the map, but let's talk about some ways that Tripp is different from all the others, I think. One, like many others, he was targeted for his political rhetoric and activities outside the college, but unlike other squeaky wheels at the time, he had the unique circumstance of actually being a state legislator, right? With the platform that came with the position, he wasn't just advocating for progressive ideas, he was actually part of the process to bring them to a vote and to bring them to law potentially, right? And he was getting in the paper when he did it, which again, I only cut a few paper clips out of there. There's so many where he's really kind of lambasted by the press for these beliefs. Two, his devout Christianity, I think, really kind of makes him a unique character as well. He was truly dumbfounded that the way he saw it, it was his Christian beliefs that identified him as a target. Because when he was legislating in ways critical of business interests, he did so he thought, as a Christian. And I honestly think that he expected the Christian leaders of Rocky Mountain College to respect his religious convictions and his activities, even if they disagreed with the actual beliefs. I also wonder just how much he was maybe a little bit naive to think that, because again, he was a historian of this era, and this all didn't just start happening in 1949. Tripp knew the history, and yet still he seems like he's just so very kind of dumbfounded and taken by surprise that this happened. Lastly, well, we kind of already talked about this, but his regret for openly advocating for progressive policies, that statement in the letter, I think that does set him way apart from others. Again, whether we take it seriously or not, he put it on paper though, and he sent it to someone. So if he was saying it ironically, which one historian said, that's what her take on it was, if he was saying it ironically, it doesn't really read that way. It's just kind of like left there on the paper, looking like a very serious statement. I don't know where I stand with that. I really don't know that. I mean, he went off again to be another representative for Cascade County the year after. He ran for representative, Democrat, Cascade County. He won the election. I looked at the legislative session record for that year. He's doing the exact same thing. He's advocating for the exact same policies. So he didn't have this like huge shift right off the bat. And then I also read some papers from when he was in Ohio, sending letters to the editor. No, there was no change in his beliefs whatsoever. So I don't know how to take that statement, but the fact that he put that on paper does make it pretty unique. Again, the more common reaction was to defend the beliefs while denying the accusations, but maybe at that point he was just too frustrated being in Canada and away from where he lived. That's it. I mean, that's really the story of Myron Tripp at Rocky Mountain College, as I at least currently understand it. Before we move to questions, kind of like the Oscar moment, I have to say thank you to a couple people because I have so much amazing help. Bobby, thank you so much for coming today. But also Bobby provided me with so much help in the archives. I've been up and down the Rocky archives. She's provided nothing but knowledge and information to me. So again, thank you so much, Bobby, for all your help. I have wonderful administrators and colleagues at the Billings Public Library who let me do this kind of thing and who listen to me do it and give me notes on how to do it better. Can't thank them enough. Stephen Frank Core over at City University of New York, he's fantastic. He wrote on a similar topic, and I couldn't thank him enough as well. So thank you, Stephen. And lastly, most importantly, of course, my wife, Annette, who listened to literally every single rendition of this in our kitchen, helped me workshop it, and thank you, Annette. And my perfect daughter, Adeline, who wanted to come and watch her dad do some history today, so thank you very much for coming. Lastly, these are some of the sources I used. If you want to look them up, if you want to learn more about academic freedom or really the history of the American historical profession in this era, whatever you want, these are some resources I recommend. And with that, I'll call it and be more than willing to answer questions. What you got?
As a politician, did he ever cross trails with the Democrat rebuke Robert Kelleher, the English parliamentarian? Did
No.
he kind of the tail of the donkey?
Not to the best of my knowledge. I didn't see anything like that in the legislative session records, but most likely I'd have to do a much deeper dive into Tripp's politics and time in Helena. Unfortunately, there's limited information because I wanted to go that route as well and really get a feel for who he was in Helena. There was one document I found online which was an oral history with a legislator, a Republican legislator at that time, and somebody had asked, what about Tripp? And I was like, oh my gosh, information on Myron Tripp, you know, it's so wonderful to come across this. The guy had one word, Tripp was a taker, which just means, I would imagine, a Democrat, looking for funding, looking for, relaxes of, more taxation, more relief, more social programs. But that was the only word I really found on Tripp during that period, so not a lot's available. Yeah. Somebody else had a question. Jesse.
You mentioned you ended up in Cascade County. Afterwards, was he back in academia up there?
Right, not really. So let me show you what happened to Myron Tripp. He unsuccessfully tried 2 more times to teach at Rocky, right? 50 and 51. Never got recognized. In March of 1950, he was appointed superintendent of schools in Nehart. And then he was elected to the state legislature again in 51, right? Representing Cascade. He resigned as superintendent after the legislative session. So he wasn't back in higher learning, but he was a part of school system, right, as superintendent of Nehart. After that legislative session, he left, and then he returned to Ohio, where his mother was very ill. So he stayed in Ohio, helped her. Now I'm off your question. I'll let you guys just know what happened to Myron at this point. He did teach at a couple of colleges in Ohio and Michigan, very small colleges. Doesn't look like he ever received tenure. He moved to Canada, we know that, sometime between 53 and 56, I don't know when, there's not much information unfortunately, but he made his way to Canada, and then he went to Australia. He went to the University of Tasmania, where I think he got a tenured position in poli-sci, political science, and then died way too young in 1978 at 61 years old. So eventually he wound up in Australia, but I don't think he ever really truly got back to academia until Australia. Yeah. Taylor.
Maybe reading your map wrong of the other occurrences of similar stories. But was there another in Montana?
Yeah, that's a great story. The AAUP starts in 1915. There's a couple of stories actually related to academic freedom. So yes, there was one at MSU Bozeman during this time. Also interjecting more Montana history. Again, AUP started in 1915. One of the very first cases they hear was the dismissal of President Craighead from University of Montana. President Craighead and 3 faculty members in 1915 were fired from their positions, and that's a fascinating story as well, which was an academic freedom violation. Of course, that's not on this map because it wasn't between 49 and 54. That is MSU Bozeman. Similar story, not quite the same though, but yeah, there was one more.
Hold on.
Thanks. No questions? Oh, Steph.
So my question is, what was the most fascinating part? What really intrigued you about it? what was like Catholics usually, you're pretty passionate about this, like.
The relation to the thesis, of course, just finding that we actually had a case here in Montana during the period that I studied in grad school so much. I spent so long on the case of James Toman, and then finding, obviously, when I was reading that letter, all I saw was AAUP, and I kind of instantly knew what I had because nobody talks about the AAUP. It's not a common acronym. I knew there was something going on, so that was fascinating. But it's shifted over time. I thought you do the historian thing where you think you know where this is going, but you need to let the evidence show you and prove to you it's not. But I felt like I knew it was going. I was surprised a couple of times, again, with this. His Christianity was so very important to him. He was so very devout. And I think he just got his feelings so extraordinarily hurt by that treatment because he thought he was over there doing what a good Christian would do. And that's a fascinating component that needs a lot more discussion and research. But definitely in this modern era, this idea that maybe Christianity is normatively tied to a certain political affiliation, right, in our minds, which in his mind was not the case. It was the opposite. I reached out to a couple of scholars on this to learn more about Quakerism, and there is this divide between East and West Coast Quakerism, and in this era, the Quakerism he was affiliated with was much more progressive-minded. So that was a huge kind of like, so that's why he was voting on his values. It really, truly was his religious beliefs.
Too, those were they on the board? Some of them, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the fascinating things that.
Like excommunicated or something? Or what?
No, and I don't think he was excommunicated or anything like that. I think he was just able to just keep going on. Like he says in his letter, he keeps paying his tithes. He remains a devout member. But nevertheless, it was a shifting over time.
So I'm John Smiley.
Hi, John.
A couple times, partly about Reverend Beale, who's
Beale.
a congregational minister and has a big history there. I mean, I'm curious about actually what the among other things, what the Congregational and Methodist congregations were doing nationally about McCarthyism, because all those things that he was pushing for they were part of the Christian faith. They're more pushed by the current UCC church, obviously, than when Reverend Beale was there.
Yeah.
But I think his deal was just being pro-business, must have been. And so I'd be interested in finding out what were those national churches doing in response to McCarthyism.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure they would have said they were anti-communist.
Right.
But they wouldn't have said they were anti-labor.
Right.
Or that they were, they certainly were, the UCC church, the Congregational church, certainly wouldn't have said it was anti-black. They were the first church to have black ministers.
Absolutely. There's a couple of books. Kevin Cruz wrote a great book, One Nation Under God, which really looks at the start of Christianity during this era, but it didn't really go too much into that. So surely there's a resource out there that would let us know more about how they handled with these accusations. But you did bring up a point that I think is worthy of mentioning, related to the board and the board at Rocky's approach. I do think that, President Copeland left immediately after this. He's gone by 51. What did he do? He went off to be a pastor. He went off to be a minister. Dean Odgers left as well. So by the time the AEP reaches out, most of the board members gone. It's like a whole new board. Dean Odgers went off to be a pastor as well. Myron Tripp was a pastor. I do think that the board, that wasn't like a claim or whatever. They were Christians. That was important to them. But they also had a bottom line, and their university was struggling financially. I took this out because it seemed like I was being kind of cheeky, but there's in the minutes like leaky water pipes are stressing them out because that's going to cost $1,000 to fix, and that's a massive hit in a time where they're selling off property or renting off property. That's what the board minutes are really flooded with, is just how are we going to make ends meet, usually property related. So when you have this professor that you want on the staff, but he goes off and does this in Helena, it might have just been a huge part of like, look, we can't have this, this is a self-protection. That's not defending one way or the other, but I do need to put myself into the shoes of the Rockies board members and think like, Because they did want a person like Tripp. They did want an academic like that.
Once again, in the early days of Montana, the editor of Helena paper, the bastion of Catholicism, the cathedral up there, the Archbishop, wrote down fulminating against Yellowstone County, claiming that we over here in the eastern part of the state were cruel Protestants. Now that he and his religion get caught in a wedge between these two warring factions.
No comment. I mean, not gonna jump into that. I have not done my research on that, so.
You're caught on a tight wire.
Yes. You had a question?
Well, my time at Rocky in the 70s, it was very clear that the Congregational, the Presbyterian, and the Methodist churches were foundational in terms of
Yes.
the thought process. But it was a very progressive time. So my thought is that across the 50s and 60s, those mainstream Protestant faiths were also transitioning from what had been very mainstream, very sort of, I would think, business-related sensibilities to the 1970s when we saw a very different Rocky in terms of what was Christianity at the time, or what was thought to be, how you thought about Christian thought at the time.
Yeah, Rocky was not immune to the times of change as well. I mean, Rocky progressed over the years. It's definitely not stuck in the 50s or anything like that. But in this era, it's not surprising that there was a sense of maybe a conservative or a protective kind of like stance on the board. So,
but I think that the other part of that story is that small liberal arts colleges struggle with the same pressures all the time.
Yes.
I'm guessing if you talk to the president of Rocky right now, he would say that the pressures of enrollment, donor funding,
absolutely.
the kinds of political discourse around the college produce a lot of pressure. And the livelihood, selling off the property up there, all of those things continue.
Yeah, they have to maintain it. They have to maintain the university.
So that makes it very important for an organization like AAUD and for a value like academic freedom to stand for how it is that knowledge would be then, funneled to your students.
Yeah.
Because if you cannot say what you think is true, then any one of those pressures can be disinvited.
Sure. Thank you for that. There was another great comment, or there's another great thing that I read about, and I'm going to close on this. Walter Metzger is a phenomenal historian of academic freedom. He wrote in 1953, and he wanted to caution us, and I really took this to heart. He said, I want to make sure that we, as historians, don't tell the story of academic freedom like it's the story of academic suppression. For the most part, academic freedom works. It works decades after decades, and it produced a phenomenal American university system, and it did. It's just that there are some periods where academic freedom charges come up, and they're bad times at the university. But that does not define the entire university system. So that really hit me when I read that, and I tried to inject that kind of thinking in this talk. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, so very much for coming out today.